Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning into the show. This is your host, Adelia Kirchner, and you are listening to Subtle Rampage.
Warning, the following program contains critical thinking, honest opinions, viewpoints on culture that may seem conservative, and a positive view on absolute detestable things such as marriage and children. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello, my fellow human beings. I hope you're all doing well and good, fine and dandy, so on and so forth. You get the gist. It is today, of all the days that exist, that I find myself wanting to pose this question, so hear me out if you will. Why does it seem like, as of late, being feminine is encouraged more so of men than it is of women? And by as of late, I mean for the last several years, if not longer at this point, but it makes zero sense, right? And I live in the United States, right? So of course when I'm referencing society or culture or general thought processes, unless I specifically mention other countries or portions of the world, you can pretty much safely assume that I'm commentating on the United States, since that's the area that I'm most familiar with, obviously. I haven't really, spent 20 years in any other country. But today I wanted to ruminate just a little bit on what femininity is, how it's perceived by society, what the traits of femininity are, and subsequently their relation to womanhood. Now, the reason I decided to do an episode on this was because I was having a conversation with my best friend, and lately she's been kind of interested in the roots of words, and I've been interested in how, we change the meanings of words sometimes, and how, English evolves over the decades and the centuries, and of course language in general does that. But I speak English, therefore I'm more interested in English itself. But we were just talking about language in general, and, words and definitions and all that fun stuff. And then we got to talking about, how society and how our culture kind of, redefines certain words, certain concepts, all that fun stuff. And eventually we started talking about femininity and masculinity and how those things are perceived by our culture and how they're approached by people in general, and it turned into hours worth of conversation on the subject. I mean, we spent a lot of time just talking, just bouncing ideas off of each other, having this big, grand, intellectual conversation about it. I mean, those are my favorite types of conversations. They make you feel smart. Okay, they do. They make you feel like freaking Plato or Socrates. I mean, they're just good conversations. And if you don't know what I mean, I recommend finding somebody that you can converse with on a deep level while at the same time setting out to entertain each other and, just talk. Trust me. Trust me on this one. But anyways, while my best friend and I, the geniuses that we are, debated the inner workings of femininity, we ended up diving into the word itself, and I took to my physical pile of dictionaries and she headed up the online definitions. And something that we kind of discovered while we were doing so is that there's two different ways to spell femininity, I guess, because we were both typing a shared document on our computers, and I think we were both kind of thinking the other person just didn't know how to spell. And I kept correcting the way she was spelling it and stuff, and finally I was like, "You're spelling it wrong," and she's just like, "No, I'm not, I'm spelling it right, you're spelling it wrong," and it was a whole thing. But just to set the record straight, okay, there is the more recent spelling of femininity, and then there is an old variant of the word, which is femininity. And if you're just looking in dictionaries and stuff, you might find one version or the other. But, there you go. You're welcome for that little tidbit of information. It confused us and made us laugh for a unwarranted amount of time. We were probably very slap happy. I don't remember what time it was, but it was probably the middle of the night. We tend to do that. But I guess to get into the actual subject matter here, why don't we just start off with society's perception of femininity? I'd say that there seems to be generally a negative perception or view of femininity in our society. I mean, it's bad to be seen as physically weaker. It's bad to be seen as emotional. It's bad to be seen as nurturing or maternal. It's bad to be seen as anything other than the top dog or the leader or the boss. Unless, of course, you're a man, because then you run into terms like alpha male, okay, which also has a negative connotation, so go figure, I guess. I mean, I don't know what you're supposed to do with that information, but yeah. I mean, unfortunately, this is an attitude that I think most of us would be able to reasonably agree is a result of the ever-evolving concepts presented by the feminist movement over the years, but, that's just not something that the feminists would be able to admit. They wouldn't be able to admit that maybe their movement's kind of done them a little dirty, right? I think regarding capability, everyone has different capabilities, so what's wrong with acknowledging that, whether you're a man or a woman? And then on a slightly different note, femininity and masculinity, like a lot of things nowadays, I think they're primarily viewed as, societal constructs. Now, my personal theory when it comes to societal constructs goes a bit like this. I think one of the things that results from viewing something as, a societal construct is rebellion. When you have something rigid, like a supposed societal construct, which in this instance would be femininity, right? There's going to be somebody, somewhere, who has an urge to rebel against that rigidness. Even if the rebellion itself is just a different societal construct, just a different form of rigidness, It's a bit like how a stereotypical teenager might rebel against their parents. I mean, and honestly, as much as all of us adults like to stir a self-righteous sense of maturity in with our coffee creamer every day, we're not any better on most occasions. Our rebellions might be a little less obvious or petty, at least that's the hope, but they are still a thing, All of this, I think, ends up forming the attitude in our culture of women disowning femininity and pushing it away, which I think is where we end up with some of the less palatable actions, like women's protests where there's not one shirt or bra in sight, or the whole, free bleeding movement, which is kind of off-putting if you ask me. Or get this one's entertaining to me. My best friend and I had a whole field day discussing this one because she's a graphic design major and also takes marketing and advertising classes, so we were just talking forever about this, but it's those commercials and those advertisements that you'll see on YouTube or whatever sometimes, where it's all these images of you with body hair, and so it's almost like the whole message of the ad is wear your body hair with pride, you don't have to shave, why should you have to shave, be empowered. And then at the same time, the whole purpose of the advertisement is to get women to shave their body hair using that company's products. It makes zero sense, and it's hilarious. And when we were having this conversation, my best friend she's like, it's kind of like us women go, we see man have power, man have body hair. Me, as a woman, have body hair, so me have power, me be man. She's right. It makes absolutely zero sense. Nothing about that makes sense. Unless I'm missing something here. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm just stupid. But anyways, and then when it comes to Hollywood and movies and TV shows and literature and books, etc., you've got this whole idea of the male gaze, which unfortunately at some point warranted the idea of the female gaze as a response. If you've spent any time watching movie reviews on YouTube or reading the articles of movie critics, I'm sure you've heard at least one of these terms before. But this idea of the male gaze is pretty much that in media, women are objectified and idealized, meaning the way that they are ultimately portrayed on screen or in books or whatever is not realistic, but actually more along the lines of what would be ideal in the mind of the male creator or the male viewer. And oftentimes, what would be ideal is something more sexualized, at least, hypothetically, for this whole idea of the male gaze, okay? For example, I remember that this male gaze was being talked about quite a bit after the release of The Queen's Gambit on Netflix a couple years ago. the main character of the show, she struggles big time with substance abuse throughout the whole series. And in the wake of the show's premiere, there was quite a bit of discussion about how this character's rock bottom, if you will, was portrayed quite differently than what people would expect to see from a male character's rock bottom. There were people who took issue with the character's, like, perfect makeup and more sultry, I guess, clothing and just the way that she was portrayed because they claimed it wasn't even close to realistic, and that the only reason for this depiction to be unrealistic was if the creators were prioritizing their male viewers and what they would be most interested in watching. And, you know, the obvious, like, rebuttal to that is, well, it's movies, it's a TV show, like, it's not supposed to be realistic, or even if it is supposed to be realistic, there's gonna be unrealistic things, like you're expecting too much from a curated world on television, right? Whichever way you look at it, I think there is something to be said for the whole, like, you know, realistic argument, because I mean, if you are a woman who has dealt with substance issues and you've hit your version of rock bottom, right? And then you watched the rock bottom portrayed in The Queen's Gambit, you'd probably kind of be like, that is like the most unrealistic thing I've ever seen. And being somebody who has not dealt with substance issues, even I can see that. Even after a night's sleep, my eyeliner would not be as perfect as this girl's makeup. You know, like, so it is, you know, a fair frustration, but at the same time, are you gonna get super upset every time a girl wakes up in a TV show and her makeup is done? Or a guy wakes up in a TV show and his hair looks good? Like, you know, I don't know. Like, where do you draw the line? Where does the representation need to be? Does it need to be there if it is movies and TV? I don't really care, is the answer. I think that's my answer. I don't really care. But anyways, with this idea of the male gaze coming into existence, we then eventually got to deal with the idea of the female gaze, which really is just a response to the former. It's not really its own standalone concept, okay? The way the female gaze is kind of like explained now, it wouldn't exist without the male gaze existing, is pretty much what I'm trying to say. But being in the college and university setting, at least personally, I've definitely had discussions about these ideas before in the classroom, and the female gaze, I guess, kind of stems from the idea that if men do it, we should too. And to me, that's kind of just another instance of the nature of rebellion that I talked about earlier. I think this whole female gaze thing really is just another result of viewing femininity as a social construct. And while we're on the subject of that nature of rebellion again, okay, let me point out, like, the amount of things that the feminist movement has done just as a way to stick it to the patriarchy or stick it to the man, or, you know, like, women need to be more like men because men can't put us in this box. Men don't need to control us, so we should do this. Like, it's all about rebelling against a structure, which takes you into structuralism and the people who feel the need to find every single structure in existence just so it can somehow be rebelled against because that's, you know, the natural thing that happens. But anyways, that's a rabbit trail. Moving on. Okay, don't get me wrong. I can see how the male gaze in film and literature can be frustrating for women. If someone were to represent me as an individual incorrectly, that would be kind of frustrating, right? Okay, like if somebody, you know, passes around a rumor about you, or if somebody perceives you a certain way and tells somebody else, hey, this person kind of sucks because blah, 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 and you're like, hey, that's not me. Okay, like, whatever. Okay, being, you know, wrongfully perceived, I guess, or however you want to put it, it's not a nice feeling, it kind of sucks, but it is what it is. You can't control the way other people see the world. So it's obviously not great to be portrayed inaccurately, is what I'm trying to say. However, I think in situations like this, we need to remember that men and women are different. If you're a woman, you can't ever possibly completely know the inner workings of men, and vice versa. And then as far as outward presentations go, there are so many different people that exist. It's hard to define, much less represent a whole group of people through a singular character or story arc. It's just, like, it's probably impossible, to be honest. The reality is that men aren't going to view women the way women view themselves. And women are not going to view men the way men view themselves. It's just not realistic. It's just not possible. I mean, it's not just biological differences that separate men and women. There's, also pretty basic characteristics that we attribute to each biological sex. I mean, let's think about stereotypical feminine traits. You've got, like, a nurturing sense. You've got sensitivity, sweetness, cooperativeness, expressiveness, humility, empathy, affection, tenderness, being emotional, being kind, being helpful and understanding. Like, these are all things that, of course, guys can have these traits as well, but they are more often attributed to women. They're more often attributed to femininity. And you might say, but Adelia, guys can be like that too. And it's like, well, yeah, obviously. Just like girls can sometimes bench just as much as their local gym bros can. Okay, however, stereotypes exist for a reason. They usually stem from some version of reality. Okay, like, they didn't just pop up out of nowhere. I mean, sometimes they do, okay, but for the most part, stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason. Okay? Also, I do just want to say this. If we view, like, how the negative perception of femininity started out, like, maybe it did originate from men. Like, maybe they are the ones who kind of, like, started this, like, negative view of these traits, right? However, for women as a whole to take on that narrative and just roll with it, okay? Like, no fighting back against it, no standing up to whoever came up with it, especially if we're saying that men are the ones who initiated it, okay? I mean, that's kind of, like, just abhorrent. Like, why are you going along with this narrative, this negative perception of femininity? Why? Like, it just doesn't make sense. I watched a lecture online a few months ago that Jordan Peterson gave. It looked like to one of his classrooms or whatever, but I thought the discussion points he offered in regard to women and motherhood were actually really interesting. And I know some people don't like him, but my current opinion on the guy is, for someone who has spent a lot of time in the intellectual sphere of academia, his thought processes actually seem to be relatively sane and, like, based in reality, which, for a person maintaining his level of education, is quite impressive. Even if there are, like, philosophies he holds or held in the past that don't really line up with everything that you or I might believe, I think he has, like, so much to say that you could probably find something in there that's beneficial. Like, something in his catalog of work that you're like, this man, smart. Like, I don't know. But regardless of that, in this particular lecture of his, he discussed several things, including the idea that the difference in sensitivity and fear between men and women is because the world is inherently more dangerous to women. And he kind of said that the world is more dangerous for women because they're in a different position in comparison to men when it comes to physical altercations and sexual dangers. Which, I think he's probably not wrong. I mean, the world is kind of more dangerous for women. I mean, it's dangerous in general, but as a whole, women are physically more prone to be harmed. That just is what makes sense. And you can, come up with all sorts of excuses and all sorts of exceptions to the rule, because there are always exceptions to the rule, but men as a whole are stronger than women as a whole. It's not too terribly difficult to figure that out. I'm just gonna go through a few of the things that Jordan Peterson said in this lecture that I watched that I found interesting, just to kind of share these, ideas, these thoughts, get you pontificating upon things of an intellectual nature. But he talks about the fact that he thinks that women's nervous systems aren't actually adapted to women. He instead says that women's nervous systems are actually adapted to the mother-infant dyad. So women aren't the same creature when they have an infant. They're way more vulnerable, and partially because they have to express the vulnerability of this little infant, and they have to care for it. And then he goes on to talk about, like, how are you going to be wired if you're going to optimally care for an infant that's under 9 months, since women generally do the bulk of child care during that age frame, the age time frame. And he's like, imagine what you need in order to be wired up biologically in order to care for an infant, because they're demanding. They're completely helpless, and they're demanding 24 hours a day of you. It's a huge, burden on the mother. Now, in my opinion, yes, that's a worthwhile burden, but it is one nonetheless, right? It's something you're taking on as a mother. And an infant under 9 months is never wrong. When they're in distress, you always respond. And Peterson goes, you never tell an infant, just go get your act together. He's not wrong, but that was kind of funny. But he's like, nothing is the infant's fault, okay? It's surrounded by this extremely threatening world, and you have to be responsive regardless of what you want, and you have to be very sensitive to the threats that emerge in this little infant's environment. You are their protector. You are their provider. You are the thing that's keeping them alive, which, just kind of piggybacking off of that, to use some university speak here, it makes me think of the people who, kind of write off stay-at-home moms, or the women who are technically stay-at-home moms, but their kids are in daycare all day or at school all day or whatever, and they're really just home, not watching kids or anything, and they go, oh, it's really not that much work. But then the moms who are genuinely at home all day, every day with their children, raising their children, homeschooling their children, are like, you said what? It's not that much work? But yeah, that's just what that makes me think of personally. But Jordan Peterson, he goes on to talk about how the price that women pay for this ability to have an intimate relationship with infants in these very early stages of development that a father is not going to have, at least not to the same extent, is that these women, their nervous systems are actually wired so they can perform in this role of motherhood optimally, in his words. They are optimally prepped, okay? They're ready to be mothers. And I just think that's insane. And my question is, okay, as a woman, if you are capable of having children, not everybody is capable physically of having children, but my question is, okay, why would you want to pay a price? Why would you want to be, on edge or wired up for this role, okay? And then never receive what you paid for, never receive what you go through all this for, Another thing that I found interesting was Peterson kind of talked about this whole situation where women are wired for this nurturing environment while men are wired for this competitive environment. So what happens when you put both men and women in, the workplace, you're putting men and women in a competitive environment. There's a difference between the types of aggression that they're going to bring to this environment, right? Women have this defensive aggression. It's emotional behavior, good or bad. Okay, it's what best suits the nurturing environment of caring for a child, of caring for children, of protecting them from the things that are encroaching into their environment, right? And then on the flip side, men have this predatory aggression, okay, which is more of this dominating behavior. And this best suits the competitive environment, which would be the workplace. And so he talks about how if women are wired to be exploited pretty much by infants, okay, if you bring that wiring into an environment where it's this predatory aggression coming at you, where it's these men who are ready to jump on whoever to get ahead, right, because that's how they're wired, it's not going to go so well for the women. And personally, what I take away from that kind of, synopsis there is what you get as a result of that situation is women who kind of try to conform to the way that men aggress. So you've got these women going into the workplace, attempting to put off this predatory aggression, okay, attempting to dominate the people around them when that's not necessarily what comes to them naturally. Now, that's not to say that predatory aggression can't be found in women, or that defensive aggression can't be found in men. But I think what I am saying is that this is just another example of how the feminist movement, the need to be equal to men, the need to, eventually it turned into the need for women to be ahead of men, okay? this need to be the same or to be above has really pushed women into a spot where they're not able to enjoy what they were made for. Instead, they believe that, oh, well, men have careers, I'm gonna have a career. Men are aggressive like this, I'm gonna be aggressive the same way. And it's like, okay. and I think this is one of those situations in which women from the past have unintentionally screwed over women in the future, okay? And it's not the only situation in which that's been the case, okay? Like, don't even get me started on the sexual revolution. Oh my goodness. But it seems that as women, okay, our feminine traits and our characteristics, they naturally lend themselves to being a woman and being a mother. You might have heard the term before, like, oh, she has the heart of a mother, or, you know, whatever, right? But it's my personal conclusion, I think, that every woman has the capability to be a mother. But just because a person is capable of something, it doesn't mean that they will accomplish it. It doesn't mean that there won't be uncontrollable things that interfere with it, like major life events, or a series of frustrating life events, okay, mental illnesses, like depression or bipolar or schizophrenia. There's, you know, plenty of reasons why somebody might not accomplish something that they actually are capable of. Just because somebody is capable of something, it doesn't mean that they will make the choice to overcome their own personal obstacles in order to accomplish it. I mean, we get in our own way. We all have, like, there's self-esteem issues, self-doubting, you know, somebody might be a perfectionist and they get a B on one paper and then they give up, you know, because they had all straight A's before and they can't change the B. Whatever it is, you know, okay? And then also, just because somebody is capable of something, it doesn't mean that they will choose to attempt the thing that they are capable of at all. They might not even want to be capable of it at the first place, but that does not mean that they are not capable of it. Does that make sense? Like, I hope I'm making sense to everybody and I don't just sound like a complete basket case. But yeah, that's kind of my conclusion on that, okay? I guess ultimately what it all comes down to for women is just a question of why. Like, why would you want to disown or to push away the things that come naturally to you? Because women are not men, you know? And how is the world supposed to function with exclusively feminine traits or exclusively masculine traits, okay? And I mean, some would probably argue that men should maintain both sets of traits, and the same goes for women. While others might argue that women should focus more on facilitating masculine traits and vice versa. But what's the point of trying to be something you are not? What is the point? Honestly. And you know, there's a balance. There's a reason to things. I mean, for the record, I think, you know, the God that I serve is a very detail-focused God. I think when he created us, when he creates anything, he does so in a very intricate manner. There's always a reasoning to these complexities, right? Like I've mentioned before, the complexities of the human body. There's so much that we don't understand, but there is so many crazy things that we have figured out that it's crazy that our bodies do these things, but it's so cool, you know? Like, everything he does ends up making sense. God is a God of reason. He's not out to cause us confusion at every turn. But you know what? I think we are. We are out to confuse ourselves constantly. And I think not everything is as confusing, you know, as we make it seem. Some things are just the way they are. Some things are simple. You know? As women, we shouldn't push our femininity away just to prove ourselves to men, but especially not to prove ourselves to other women or to ourselves. Does that make sense? I mean, especially with the freedoms and the choices, okay, that we have in modern day society, genuinely, what's the point? What is the point? But with that being said, we have come to the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed the listen, and if you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and or follow the podcast on your streaming platform of choice. New episodes of Subtle Rampage air every Wednesday morning, so make sure you don't miss out on new content. See you next time.